Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is George Toscano. I'm the Vice President of Quality Systems at NSF Pharma Biotech. Thank you all for joining today's call on data integrity regulatory perspectives. Before we get started, let me cover a few logistical items. This webinar will be recorded, and you'll be able to receive a link for the recording. Feel free to submit any questions you have during the presentation using the chat window. We will have time at the end of the presentation to address those questions. So without further ado, let's dive into today's topic. My name, just by way of introduction, is George Toscano. I said I'm the VP of Quality Systems for NSF Health Sciences. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for over 20 years in a variety of different roles. I started out in the laboratory and moved into laboratory management. I did a lot of analytical research and quality control work, and eventually moved into quality assurance roles. My expertise primarily lies with laboratory controls. I've done extensive work with data integrity and have a strong background in quality systems. A lot of the consulting work that I have done over the past 10 years has been focused on addressing data integrity enforcement actions related to 483s, warning letters, consent decrees, import alerts, and AIP for a variety of our clients. Now, many of these terms are probably familiar to many of you on this call. However, the term AIP is probably an unusual one for many of you. So AIP stands for Application Integrity Policy, and it is rarely invoked by the FDA, but it has been invoked at least 5 or 6 times. And really what it pertains to is fraud or untrue statements of material facts. So this is really the final stage, if you will, of enforcement for data integrity concerns. And in this case, the FDA will actually no longer review applications that are pending for the sponsor, and they will, in some cases, prohibit you from marketing approved products. So it's really an egregious condition to reach with data integrity. It's very severe. So moving on, we'll go through the agenda of what we intend to cover. We're going to cover the regulatory expectations. Primarily, we're going to focus on 2 regulators. We're going to focus on US FDA and MHRA. And then we will go over the regulatory landscape, which is really composed of a couple areas. Number one is the regulations that are in place for both US FDA as well as MHRA. And we will also cover guidance documents which help industry with interpretation of those regulations. After we cover that, we'll move on to inspection trends. And what we're going to focus on here is US FDA because they are more readily available. And NSF has done some research into FDA inspection trends related to data integrity, which we'll go through to give you an insight into where the regulators are looking and what types of issues they are finding. Finally, we'll wrap up the presentation with comments and questions, which I alluded to earlier. Anybody is free to comment or provide questions all throughout this webinar in the chat feature. And we'll get to as many as we can, time permitting. Moving on to the next slide. I'd like to start the webinar with this question. What is the most cited type of data integrity finding in warning letters? And I think this one is kind of surprising to some, but really it's a very basic deficiency, which is really around incomplete or missing record. We did a study from 2005 all the way to 2017, and we looked at all warning letters issued by US FDA. Of that entire population of warning letters, what we found was 107 of the warning letters had missing or incomplete records. This is out of the 154 warning letters that were tied to data integrity type findings. So examples of these include just missing information, such as the sample preparation or the standard preparation is not documented in the notebook. The weight supporting those preparations is not available. Sometimes we're missing entire notebooks. Sometimes entire batch records are missing or pages of the batch records are missing. Cleaning records, sterilization records, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but this is to illustrate the type of issues that FDA is finding and citing in warning letters for missing information. Moving on, we'll start to cover some of the regulatory expectations. So starting with FDA, one of the things that's really important for everyone to realize, and I think that there's a misconception out there, is that data integrity relates to fraudulent activity or falsification of data. And the reality is that that's just a small sliver of data integrity issues. Really what it pertains to is anything that compromises the accuracy or reliability of data. Intentional or deliberate actions to defraud or to falsify is not a requirement for this to rise to a data integrity issue. In fact, many of the data integrity issues that we cite or that we find or that the regulators find are indeed not related to deliberate acts of fraud or falsification, but these are unintentional acts that still compromise the accuracy or availability of the data. And when we start to think about data integrity, one of the things that we want to focus on is the Alcoa principles, and that's tying to accuracy, the legibility, the contemporaneous nature of data, that the data is originable, and that the data is available. So all of these things are contributing factors to the accuracy and reliability of the data, and they all play an important part. One of the other things that's very interesting is that trust is a very important part of what the FDA considers when they're thinking about data integrity. And so companies generate reams of data. They put them together in submissions, whether they're ANDAs, NDAs, DLAs, or other types of regulatory submissions. And the FDA is really counting on the company to be doing the right thing and being truthful in the information that they provide. And it's really foundational to the relationship between the company and the FDA that the trust is there. If during inspections or during review of other documents they find instances of people lying to them or being less than truthful, then it starts to erode at that trust with the FDA, and it makes for more of an adversarial type relationship, which is really not where you want to be. So it's always important to be transparent and provide accurate information and be truthful during inspections or in the submission of any kind of documentation or data to the FDA. Another interesting note with the FDA is that they've included data integrity as one of the core objectives in their inspections for prior approval inspections or PAIs. And this was started in 2010. So in addition to verifying the application and verifying suitability for commercial manufacture, data integrity is one of the primary objectives, which is important because you will start to see how this impacts regulatory enforcement and how the increase in warning letters tied to data integrity type observations has increased. Not only is this a primary objective of the inspectors at FDA, but they have also undergone training, specific training for data integrity purposes, and so they are now more skilled at finding data integrity issues and know how to inspect for these. So this is an important consideration. Moving on to slide number 6, we start to look at the MHRA and their expectations for data integrity. So the approaches are very similar between MHRA and FDA, but there are some differences. So MHRA looks more from a risk-based perspective, and they talk about concepts that the FDA doesn't really explicitly call out. And a couple of concepts here that we want to talk about are data risk and data criticality. So when we're talking about putting controls in around data integrity or how rigorous should our data integrity program be to protect certain pieces of data, one of the things that we want to factor in is these elements of risk. So data risk specifically refers to how at risk the data is that's generated on a particular system or as part of a particular process. So to illustrate this, if we had a system that generated data and it was vulnerable to amendment, so if somebody can log into the system, generate the file, and delete the file, well, that particular system has a high data risk because the protection of the data or the ability for that data to be amended is higher, as opposed to a system with low data risk, which would be a system where there are tight controls, and after acquisition of the data, it is protected and not available to the user to make modifications such as deleting the file or renaming the file post-acquisition. So that's a system with tighter data controls, which lowers the data risk. Moving on to data criticality, this really pertains to, well, what is the data used for? What decision is it influencing? And so when you look at release data or data supporting the release of a finished product, such as assay or impurity data, that data directly supports release and disposition of commercial product or stability. And so that is critical data, as opposed to records for, let's say, a warehouse that stores components where we're looking at temperature and humidity. While the data is also important, it's not as critical, certainly, as data that's supporting the release of a finished product. So those are the spectrums that you want to be looking at data integrity and assessing this, the risk and the commensurate controls that you'd apply to controlling data in these respective settings. The other thing that the MHRA looks at a lot is the data lifecycle, and I think it's an important consideration to look at because many people associate data integrity with the upfront part, which is the generation of the data, the capturing of it, the processing, and the reporting of it. So while that's a very important piece of the data integrity lifecycle, it's not the complete lifecycle. So there is still the data archiving, the backup, and the restore, and ultimately the disposition or destruction of data. And so these are pieces that are really critical to making sure that the data is available for audit, and it could be sometimes 3-4 years after the fact. But when we look at the number one finding, it's around missing data. So we can see that it's an important aspect to keep the data throughout the entire life cycle. And the last thing that I'll say about MHRA is that their guidance and their expectations are not just for GMP. So the guidance document that they've issued in May 2018 is GXP Data Integrity Guidance and Definitions. And this is applicable to good clinical practice, good distribution practice, good laboratory practice, good manufacturing practice, and good pharmacovigilance practice. So it's a very broad interpretation and broad expectation for data integrity across the entire landscape there. And again, the other thing that they focus on is data governance, which the FDA doesn't explicitly call out. And when we're looking at data governance, we're looking at all of the systems in place to support data integrity. And what we're looking at is the training. Are the personnel trained on data integrity? Can they detect it in their workplace? Is there an internal audit program to detect data integrity? So all these things and how it's incorporated into the quality system. So the MHRA goes to great lengths to describe the data governance program, and US FDA doesn't explicitly call this out, although the expectations for maintaining data throughout the life cycle are still there for both regulatory agencies. Moving on to slide number 7. So this is the bare minimum. These are the regulations. And one of the things that's important to note is that data integrity didn't just arrive 10 years ago. Data integrity has always been around, and it's always been incorporated into the core GMPs, such as 210, 211 for US FDA CGMPs, and then Part 11 is newer, and I say that it's been about 15 or 20 years, so it's been around for some time as well, but certainly a little bit newer than the GMPs. And then the sister documents are the MHRA EU GMP Volume 4, as well as EU Annex 11. So these documents, which are really the minimum regulations, they incorporate a lot of data integrity aspects as well, as we'll see on the next slide. So focusing really on the US CGMPs, if you look at all of these Alcoa principles around original records or complete records, or protection of the data from deterioration or loss, it's already been expectations and requirements in the GMPs from the beginning. So when you start to look at some of these requirements, they're not new requirements tied to data integrity guidance documents that emerged in the last couple of years. They've actually been with us for quite some time. I'll just take an example of a few of these. When we're starting to look at original records, one of the things that the data integrity guidance documents have provided some clarity on is, well, what truly is an original record or a true copy of the record. So if you look at the terminology that they put forward in these guidance documents and talk about static and dynamic records. Well, an HPLC chromatogram that's printed out would be a static record, but truly the system that generates HPLC chromatograms, the data acquisition system, is generating dynamic records, because the hard copy printout of a chromatogram, whether it's LC or GC, would not be able to give you the full information that's contained in the electronic record. So the scaling, being able to zoom out peaks and seeing if all the peaks are integrated, seeing if the integration is appropriate, and whether there or not there's inhibited integration or different baseline events that would obscure certain peaks from being recorded. All of that is not available to you until you go onto the original record, which would be the electronic system. So while the requirements have always existed, the guidance documents that have come out have provided some additional context to how these documents are applied, or how these regulations are applied. So moving on, we'll go to slide number 9, and we'll start to look at not the regulations, but the guidance documents to help industry with interpretation of some of these regulations. And so you'll see that the most recent one is the MHRA guidance, which we talked about earlier in March 2018. But in 2016, there was a number of documents that were put out by a number of regulatory bodies, both FDA, MHRA, PICS, EMA, WHO, and all of these documents were put out, all these guidance documents were put out to help industry with interpretation of data integrity issues. And certainly we have seen an uptick in enforcement around data integrity, and I think the goal here is to really help industry with what the expectations are that the regulators are looking for, and these documents are very helpful in that regard. If you look at the FDA guidance document, it's more of a question and answer, and it covers certain specific questions around control of blank forms, specific questions related to the audit trails and their review. And then when you look at other documents like the PICS or WHO, these are very, very comprehensive documents that go to great length to describe very detailed instances of how to control certain data integrity elements. So these are all very helpful documents. I would encourage anyone who is looking at setting a data governance program in place, or putting in data controls, or just wanting to get a better understanding of data integrity expectations, or even putting some of these into your data integrity training programs. I would encourage you to look at these respective guidance documents, because they really give you a good insight into what the regulators are expecting. Moving on to slide number 10, we're going to start to look at some inspection trends. So what the regulators are actually doing in terms of enforcement, and where they're keying in on, what certain areas are they hitting on. So I alluded to earlier that NSF did an exhaustive review of warning letters, all warning letters issued by US FDA from 2005 to 2017. From the thousands of warning letters that they issued, we called 156 out that were related to data integrity. And so those are the ones that we've kind of looked at, and we did a dissection of each and every one of those warning letters to see what types of findings that the FDA was keying in on. And we'll start to go into those in the next couple of slides. Moving on to slide number 11. When you look at slide number 11, this gives you the distribution of warning letters over these years, from 2005 to 2017. As you can see, the trend is definitely up. And one of the things that's interesting is 2013 to 2017, we've seen a big increase in warning letters, averaging around 20 or so warning letters every year with data integrity findings. Coincidentally, we alluded earlier to the CPMG, the Compliance Policy Guidance Manual that the FDA put out, and that the FDA is now looking for data integrity specifically, and that they are training their inspectors to find data integrity specifically. So, this rise in warning letters around data integrity certainly may have something to do with the fact that the inspectors are much better trained, and it is one of their primary objectives during inspections as well. So when people think of warning letters, I know that there's certain countries that get a lot of attention, and they get put in the news and certainly circulated in different pharmaceutical publications around certain companies or certain countries that have a high incidence of warning letters related to data integrity. But I wanted to put this together because this is really interesting. And so if you look at this, the majority of data integrity warning letters are actually issued in the United States, followed by India and then China. And, you may wonder why the U.S. actually has the greatest amount of warning letters. Well, the greatest amount of inspections also occur in the U.S. So, just by law of probability, because there's so many more inspections in the U.S., you start to see that percentage being high. But it's not really an issue. Data integrity is not really an issue that's relegated to any one country. It's really across the board, as you can see here, that there are data integrity challenges among many, many different countries across the world. So, moving on, we'll go to the next slide. This is a very interesting slide because this slide is actually the detail of where all the different findings are being found. So this is a distribution of findings from all of the warning letters that we reviewed and how many hits or how many incidences of this type of issue that we find in the warning letters. So certainly number one, we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, the incomplete or missing records, which is basically mentioned in nearly 70% of all the warning letters cited have incomplete or missing records as one of the components. And we'll go down the list and talk about a few of these. So privilege levels are also very high on the detection radar for US FDA. And these really relate to individuals having permissions on data systems that they should not have. For example, this could be chemists or analysts in the laboratory having administrator rights, where they have the ability to generate data and delete data or disable audit trails or have certain permissions on these systems that they really should not have as end users of these systems. And so that's picked up in 32% of all the data integrity warning letter findings. The next one that's really high on the list is the whole concept of integration, reprocessing, and manual integration. So in these cases, the integration for the peaks in chromatograms, LC or GC, are either not appropriate or they're being manipulated in some way to either make things pass or shade peaks, or the integration is just not appropriate, and also the use of manual integration. Now, in and of itself, manual integration is not a problem if it's used sparingly and under appropriate controls and with appropriate approvals. When manual integration is used rampantly and there's no controls for it, then that becomes a problem, and the FDA will cite you for excessive manual integration with no approval or no procedure to guide that type of integration. Interestingly enough, after that is destroying or deleting original GMP records, which I'm surprised that it's on here, but I'm not surprised because during a lot of the inspections and audits that we do, we find a lot of these same issues that the FDA is finding as well. And this can be notebook pages that are missing, or this can be pages from a batch record that have been taken out and thrown into the garbage. And this really ties in well with the control that you have over your documents or blank records. More and more laboratories now are not using bound notebooks anymore, but they're using forms to capture data. And a lot of these forms are not very well controlled, and so you'll find companies or individuals making multiple copies of sheets to record data, making a mistake, and then crumbling up and throwing it into the garbage. Well, that's the original data that you basically throw into the garbage, and so this is what we're talking about, these types of issues here. And then I'll just come up to the top five, which is audit trails. Now, issues around audit trails really span audit trails not being enabled, audit trails not being reviewed at all, or audit trails being users having the ability to disable them. So there's a lot of different things that happen around audit trails that are cited over and over again, or audit trails, just being reviewed once a year, right? And so there's no justification for that type of frequency. So these types of issues pop up again and again. Interestingly enough, you have to go kind of toward the middle of the list to actually see falsified data. So this goes back to the point that there's a lot of items that would contribute to data integrity that are not deliberate or intentional acts to defraud. So falsified data only pops up 12% of the time in these warning letters. So this goes to dispel the myth that data integrity is only when there is intent. Really, that's a piece of it. But as you can see, it's not a very significant piece of it. It's a small percentage of it. So that's really what I wanted to talk about there. And these other examples, some of these are pretty self-explanatory. But if there is any additional clarity that somebody would like around some of these, feel free to reach out to me my contact information will be at the end of the webinar. This next chart, really on page 14, is nothing more than a reiteration of the previous chart, but it's giving you distribution more graphically so that somebody can get to see how big incomplete or missing records is related to the other findings. It's by far and away the biggest finding that pops up over and over again. So now I'll move on to slide number 15. So slide number 15 is an offshoot of the review that we looked at for all these different warning letters that were cited. And what we started to see is a big uptick in import alerts that are issued to companies outside of the U.S., and it's really picked up in 2016 and 2017. And one of the things that you'll see that trigger import alerts is when a company denies or refuses an FDA inspector from looking at certain areas, or when there is definitely evidence, objective evidence of falsification or fraudulent activities. Those will all lead to import alerts. And also, if the FDA cannot verify data, so if there is evidence of deletion of a number of files on electronic systems, FDA doesn't know whether these were passing or failing results, and so these may also trigger import alerts issued by the FDA to companies in different countries. Moving on to slide number 16, this is really just a different representation of that. You see that a lot of the import alerts are really coming out of India and China, are dominating the import alerts, with a few other import alerts in Hungary, United Arab Emirates, and Mexico. But by far and large, it's India and China that are getting hit with a lot of these import alerts. Moving on to slide number 17, this is FDA recommendations for third parties, and this is something that we've seen a significant uptick in. At the back portion of a lot of these warning letters that the FDA is issuing, the FDA is recommending that companies procure a third party to come in and do an independent and credible review of the data integrity concerns. And this points back to it's hard to investigate yourself if you have problems around data integrity. So the FDA is advocating that companies seek a third party who's skilled in the art at looking for data integrity issues and determining the extent of these issues to provide a credible independent third-party review. And the FDA has been more and more a proponent of this, and as you see in 2016, 16 of the warning letters issued have recommendations for third parties to be brought in to assist companies with these types of data integrity reviews. That really completes our webinar. This is really just meant as a teaser to give you some ideas of where the agency's thinking are and what the findings that they're finding and where they're keying in on. This is our contact information. My contact information is at the bottom, gtoscano@nsf.org. You can visit our website at nsfpharmabiotech.org. We do a number of different items besides data integrity. We do auditing, assessments, the general quality system work. We also do regulatory and have an extensive and robust training and education program at NSF as well. So I would encourage everybody to come and visit our site and learn more about our service offerings. And with that, I want to thank you all for attending the webinar. And I will take a look at some of the questions that have been popping up in the chat. And let me take a quick look here. So here's a question around audit trails. One of the questions that we have here, and I think this would be a good one to answer because I get this one quite a bit during my audits and my field work with various clients. And the question is, how do we determine what we need to review in audit trails and how often we have to review them? Okay, so this is a good question that comes up a lot. So audit trails for various systems can look in a variety of different ways, and there's a lot of information contained in the audit trails at times that is not relevant or pertinent to what you need to review. Really, when you start to think about an audit trail, the analogy that I try to use to bring it to everybody's understanding is if you have a notebook or a laboratory record or a batch record and you make a mistake, you have to cross it out, you initial and date it, you put the corrected value, and you say why you had to correct it. So that's really all we're trying to do, but it's on an electronic system. So we want to know who did the change, what the change was, when did it change, and why did it change. So those are the things that we want to look for. So that's what you need to look for in an audit trail. Now, how often you should look for or how often you should review the audit trail, let's go back to the concept of data criticality and data risk. How vulnerable is the system to being amended? If you have systems that are very tightly controlled and there is no possibility for the user to change any critical parameters, well, then that negates to a large extent the requirement for an audit trail review. However, if you have a system where users have privilege levels where they can modify and make certain modifications to data, such as reprocessing data or changing certain key parameters, well, then that would warrant an audit trail review more frequently, depending on whether the data is used for supporting product release, which would be high criticality, so that would drive for a high frequency of audit trail review, if not every time. But data that's, again, on tightly controlled systems where the data risk is low and the data criticality is low may certainly warrant a lower frequency of audit trail review. Okay, so that's how I answer that question. Actually, I have run out of time, so what I will do is I will take any additional questions that I see in the chat and I will respond to those after the webinar. And I want to thank everyone for their time, and I hope the webinar was beneficial. Thank you. Bye.